On? Okay, so welcome to the audience here at the NUPI, and to those of you following us online. My name is Tora Berge Naterstad. These last few weeks, we've seen record after record of daily COVID cases being broken in Russia, and the country has among the highest death tolls in the world. Experts are estimating that the pandemic may have lowered the Russian life expectancy by up to 5 years. So it's becoming increasingly clear that this is a very acute crisis for the Kremlin. But on the other hand, we also know that these kinds of shocks represent political opportunities. And so in a dark way, the timing could not be better to welcome someone who's written extensively on the relationship between power and the governance of human life in Russia. But before I give the floor to Andrey Makarychev, professor at the Johan Skytte Institute in Tartu, a few practical things. Andrey will be speaking for half an hour, and then we will open for questions from the audience. Those of you following us online can, of course, start asking questions right away. And then, last but not least, the whole event is being streamed and recorded. And with that, Andrey, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Each travel in these exceptional times is an exception. And thank you for inviting me, and I'm really happy to be here in Oslo again and to see many familiar faces in the audience. So my story is about COVID, something which affects our daily lives in all countries. But I will be more specifically focusing on Russia, because this is one of my objects of research for years. And since this is research in the making, project in the making, I don't have a very, let's say, well-defined conclusions. It's mostly like a story that continues, and we don't know what would be the destination point, of course. And again, since it's a research project, I'm supposed to start with something more or less academic, but that's not for a long time, just maybe for a couple of minutes. In my research, I have a couple of points of departure that might be formulated in a Foucauldian sense, well, which is not a surprise, because Michel Foucault is known as one of the founding fathers of biopolitics. So one of them is my interest in how medicine and politics are intersecting with each other, in the sense that what we are observing in many countries is medicalization of political debate, the infusion of medical concepts into political discussions, and the other way around, politicization of medical knowledge, kind of extension of medical knowledge beyond the sphere of medical establishment in hospitals, with some kind of degree of publicity of medical discourse. And what I'm interested in is how new discourses appear, especially in non-liberal or illiberal countries, including Russia, and why it matters for political, for the whole political spectrum, and particular for political agency. And that's exactly something which connects my research to the project that we are involved in, including the issue of legitimacy of Putin's regime and the new type of political subjectivity that might come out of this crisis. And the second point is what happens to this nexus between knowledge and power. We know that, again, based on the Foucauldian scholarship, that each type of power, each type of politics is supposed to be based on some kind of knowledge. Do we have this knowledge right now? No, we don't. So how does this situation of either shaky knowledge or uncertain knowledge or unknowledge, how it affects the most important political categories, especially again in illiberal countries, the category of legitimacy, and also some other concept that we used to think as already more or less established, already more or less set, like, for example, trust, solidarity, justice, and some others. So why biopolitics? Well, before COVID, it was not that easy always to explain why do we need biopolitics. Starting from 2020, it became a little bit easier. So basically, it's about medicalized society, a society again in which different health-related issues are again, applied beyond the scope of medicine. It's about debates on what is normal, what is abnormal, and how these categories are re-established, again, not in a, let's say, a routine everyday situation, but in situations of emergency, and how these perceptions of norm and normality are driven by certain discourses. And that's exactly what I'm going to talk about. And another interesting point that is observable in many countries is that public health becomes an issue of high politics, with concomitant a phenomenon of biopolitical nationalism, in the sense that each expertise should be local, should be national, that each type of knowledge should be somehow related to national political communities and what is known as a national collective body of the nation. So biopolitics in this sense is a useful tool to understand how human lives are connected, as Tora mentioned from the very beginning, to the political sphere, how human lives are categorized, and how they are differentiated. So now, Russia. I have a group of discourse producers, and some of them, I mean, they're visualized, and one of the groups is what I would call them early deniers, in the sense that in the media you could find at least 3 personalities. Starting from February, March 2020, we're sending a quite a clear message to the society through the media, and these people are quite well known. I would call them discourse producers. So one is Alexander, and all of them, by the way, are professionals in medical sphere. So basically, I'm not talking about journalists, let's say, narratives or discourses, or just some vernacular, whatever, rumors or conspiracy theories. I'm going to focus basically on those whose speaking position might be represented as kind of speaking on behalf medical community. So one of them is Alexander Misnikov, or Dr. Misnikov, who, apart from his regular appearances in the media, in the YouTube, he was also a press secretary, a kind of spokesperson for the Moscow Mayorship Commission on fighting COVID-19 in spring 2020. Then you have Elena Malasheva, again a very well promoted TV star, TV anchor with a medical background, and then you have Leonid Rashal, a professional doctor. Then the vaccine gurus. At least 2 persons are definitely at the center of a different type of discourse. Alexander Ginsburg, the head of the Gamaleya Institute, the major producer of Sputnik, and then Kirill Dmitriev, the head of Russian Foundation for Direct Investment, the main wallet for Sputnik V project. And both of them are very public, by the way. Then you have a group of social activists. Anastasia Vassilieva, the head of Doctors Alliance, or Alliance of Doctors, a very politicized type of social and political activity, much less politicized in the last couple of weeks, but I will talk about that a little bit later. And then you have an unexpected discourse maker, which is Maria Shukshina. She's an actress, but she was quite active in hosting and organizing roundtables with professional medical doctors and specialists in virology and other medical disciplines who are very skeptical about the whole idea of mandatory vaccination. So she just represents this type of discourse. And then you have policy experts, and I will start with them, including Sergei Medvedev, who probably is known here in Oslo, and Gleb Pavlovsky and some others. So it's easier to start with policy experts, in the sense that most of them would agree that what happened in Russia in the last couple of years is an appearance of a new regime of what they would call medical governance. And in this sense, Russian discourse develops very much in line with the Western concept of medicalized governance, pandemic authoritarianism, which is also quite, well, I would say, quite visible in the Western debate. Vladimir Gelman mentioned an interesting thing, saying that there is a difference between administrative elements of crisis management and the function of caretaking and saving lives. And what he claims is that administrative, including statistical and controlling function, prevail. And he claims that the Rospotrebnadzor, the key controlling body as a state of the government, is more important than healthcare ministry, which is kind of counterintuitive. But this is also a part of this idea of a medical governance and medicalized society. The Liberal Mission Foundation is known for its report on how the pandemic affected electoral system in Russia, and the major conclusion is that it has broadened the spectrum for all practices of electoral fraud and different manipulations with elections. So in this sense, for electoral process, COVID-19 is not a good news. And Ekaterina Shulman, another quite important speaker on behalf of a community of political experts, also followed suit, saying that the emergency situation created an opportunity for different lobbying initiatives that have been quite successful just because of the situation of emergency, and no one is really looking that, how shall I say, attentively at what is going on in the parliament. So she claimed that some corporate lobbies were quite successful in promoting their interest under the umbrella of exceptional times. Now, this discourse, new discourse makers, well, I would call one of them, Dr. Misnikov, cynical realism, in the sense that he, again, speaking on behalf of medical knowledge, he from the very beginning said that, yes, there is mortality, but people die anyway. So there is nothing, let's say, unusual in this fact. It's only 2% of mortality. He said 2% we can afford this. And especially it's old people who die, and young people are relatively unaffected. And he was quite cynical in saying, if you don't like what I'm saying, it's up to you, don't watch. But that's exactly what we in the medical community discuss. Those who are supposed to die will die. This is a very biopolitical type of statement. And then he said that the mortality of COVID is not that high if we compare it to mortality of hunger, for example, on a global scale. I think he a little bit manipulates with numbers and figures, but still. And then he also came up with the conclusion that there is very little we can do. He even said that masks are useless. We don't have antivirus medicine, but we do have vaccines. We could be safe for doing nothing. That's what he said. So all this panic, in his view, is just a hysterical reaction of the society. But something happened with the Sputnik V being part of Russian, let's say, domestic and foreign policy. And at a certain point, he kind of changed his discourse to say, no, but vaccination is okay. Vaccination is not only okay, it should be mandatory. And you see how inconsistent this discourse is. Speaking about the low level of vaccination in Russia, you definitely need to take into account these inconsistencies, because it's millions of people that watch this discourse and they draw their conclusions out of that. Then Helena Malsheva, who is the TV anchor, she has her medical TV show, Жить здорово, Life is Cool, and yeah, and she was a pioneer in kind of inventing a new language that might explain physiological and biological issues of the human body for the public, how our body functions. She visualizes certain issues, including the most intimate. So she's known for bringing up the issues of body to the public scrutiny. And what she started from is that it was March, April, spring 2020. So here in Russia we are safe. It's only in the West that they have some kind of issues, but here in Russia, and I think this is a political statement, saying that, yes, of course we are different. Our bodies are different, or whatever, we have a better immunity, or whatever. Then, when she started understanding that this is too much, she changed her discourse and said, yeah, the virus does exist, but this is a miracle. A miracle since mostly it kills only old people. And for this statement, which is kind of a combination of optimism and, again, cynicism, she was heavily criticized in the media. And at a certain point, I even thought that her career is over with this, but it's not the case. It's not over. Of course, she was very positive about, again, praising Russian epidemiologists as a super organized team of professionals. And ultimately, this boils down to a kind of mythology of a pure Russian body that miraculously remain unaffected by the virus, which I think it's also in addition to this political way of thinking about virus. And then Naterstad, well, he is head of Scientific Institute of Urgent Children's Surgery. He's president of National Medical Chamber. Again, he was known as one of these de facto deniers, saying that, yes, we had a brilliant Soviet medicine, so there is nothing to be afraid of. Then, but just almost quotation, there is nothing happens, just people need to live their normal lives. And again, the inconsistency of this type of discourse is quite clear with this shift from there is nothing to, oh, I don't understand why people do not get vaccinated. It's just in a matter of 1 year. Well, there is an answer why people do not get vaccinated, because they were told from week to week that they don't have reasons for that. And then the interesting thing is that his trajectory brings him to some kind of conspirological interpretation of the virus. So from complete denial to saying that this is a rehearsal for a future biological war against Russia, of course. Then you have two personalities that are directly related to Sputnik V. One is Alexander Ginsburg, who is the head of Gamaleya Institute. By the way, as far as I know, in the European Union and in other countries, there is a code of ethical standards that prevent producers of vaccines to go public with explaining their merits and their advantages. That's why it's very rare that we would hear something like that from direct producers of Pfizer or other vaccines. But this is not the case of Russia. He's very public. And what he said, sometimes it's really important to understand what Sputnik V is about. He acknowledged that, yes, Sputnik V was produced under the emergency kind of legislation, and the government allowed the Gamaleya Institute to do some procedures differently, as compared to the, let's say, normal modus operandi. So he said, yeah, that some of them could be done in a shorter period of time, which basically I think is an important element for understanding why Sputnik V is not accepted. I'm not speaking about European Medicines Agency, but even WHO. Then there were many controversies in his discourse, in the sense that he started with, again, these very optimistic statements that, well, Sputnik V is effective against all types of viruses. And then, when it turned out that a very significant percentage of Russians who have been vaccinated with Sputnik V are still in hospitals, and yeah, something is going on. Oh, I know what's going on. First, it's new mutations. But you said that new mutations is not a problem, just maybe a few months ago. Okay, new mutations is a problem for Sputnik V. And then, in another important point, he alleged that many Russians could have just, illegally purchased these certificates. That's why they are in the hospitals. And then he said, I know the solution. We have a testing procedure to test those Russians who are in the hospital, whether their certificates are fake or real. So it's again a technological solution to the well, I would say social issue of cheating and skipping regulations. Now, Kirill Dmitriev, it's a very interesting figure, again, a head of a state corporation named Russian Foundation for Direct Investments. I would call his discourse promotional patriotism, in the sense that he's a businessman. I mean, he's interested in marketization of the product and getting some revenues. But in the meantime, he's very patriotic. In each second of his speeches, he definitely refers to Putin, to the Kremlin, how important is this. Well, I would say that if some of you remember this Putin's characterization of sovereignty as a competitive advantage, I think that's exactly what happens with this type of discourse. So yes, we are corporate, representing corporate business, the logic of corporate business, but in the meantime we act patriotically. With these statements like this, Sputnik is the safest vaccine accepted in the entire world. You see how easily you can manipulate with words and present your product as allegedly being number one. Then he had to admit something which again is very important, that yes, Russia registered Sputnik V before the third stage, Now you have an explanation for why Sputnik faces some issues, but this is not a problem. This is a leadership. This is what leadership is about. So you need to be proactive, and you need to sometimes, how shall I say, ignore certain regulations. This is a very political statement. So if you have an emergency, you don't need to follow the rules, and that's exactly what Sputnik V is about: a business project and a political product in many respects. And of course, there is ample space for this type of traditional discourse on Sputnik V is intentionally attacked by the West, by this octopus of the largest pharmaceuticals, and they are playing a game with us, and the complexity of each stage is going up and up, so we don't know what are the rules of the game, which is not, of course, true. And the ultimate goal of this octopus is to kill, of course, to kill Sputnik V. So that's why I'm calling this promotional patriotism. It's always like Russia versus the West in this type of discourse. And he also, again, I think this is a violation of ethical standards, again, saying that, yes, Russian vaccine is more traditional. Western vaccines are more innovative, but that's exactly what the weakest point is, because we don't know what would be the long-term consequences of these innovative vaccines. And his characterization of this memorandum of understanding between AstraZeneca and Sputnik V, not as a cooperation, which would be mutually beneficial, but as a Russian help to AstraZeneca. It's like, you know, our, how shall I say, our hand that we would like to give to the West. Well, I think I can skip that because there is some context in which we might need to place this discourse. Let's look at Doctors Alliance and Anastasia Vassilieva and her, I would say, medical oscillations between different positions. I know how many of you are familiar with the Doctor Alliance. Well, this is, I would say, an independent trade union of medical workers that have been established only 3 years ago, with an original agenda which looks very technical. It's medical awareness, it's lobbying for financial funds, for hospitals, and it's more space for independent medical expertise, it's more professionalism, legal advice in case if it's needed, and psychological assistance to nurses that sometimes need to work hard, especially in cases of emergency. So that was an agenda which I would say was quite technical, but at a certain point the discourse of Doctors Alliance and Vassilieva person became much more politicized, and this politicization is explained by the beginning of their, let's say, political romance with Alexei Navalny. Doctors Alliance became one of the major contributors to FBK, Foundation for Fighting Corruption. And look at how much politicized this discourse became. So with Covid-19. So basically they're trying to expose some of the information or some of the assessments of the crisis that were not part of the official mainstream discourse, saying that Russia ranks very high in the mortality ranking. So people are dying, in fact, that losses are huge, like equivalent of 4 budgets of the Sochi Olympics. They advocated for opening up Russia to foreign vaccines. They advocated for protection of labor rights of medical personnel, and they uncovered multiple violations of rights of patients. So basically claiming that mandatory vaccination is against the law, that yes, we need to explain. So our function as medical doctors is to explain and to have facts and all these arguments, but it's not emergency. So we cannot introduce de facto mandatory vaccination, especially, and she alluded to that we are not 100% sure about the safety of Russian vaccine and its compliance with existing norms, etc., etc. Side effects are impossible to establish, and the basic idea is coercion is unacceptable, and vaccination is also questionable. So this type of discourse kind of, somewhere in the middle. Yes, on the one hand, we recognize the gravity of the situation, but not at the expense of let's say, normal rights of people as human beings and patients. And now something happens in autumn 2021, just literally a couple of months ago. Anastasia Vassilieva made a statement saying that we are breaking relations with the network of Alexei Navalny. Because when I was facing, she said, when I was facing a legal trial, no one from Navalny helped us. And then she developed this argument into saying something which is shockingly, how shall I say, identical to the Kremlin's discourse. Basically saying that meetings of protests are completely useless. They don't have any perspective. I want to help my country. I don't want to fight my country. So basically, she started developing exactly the discourse that would be the opposite to the original discourse. For example, yeah, I wanted to be just a mediator, but Navalny used us. War is bad, peace is good. So in the future, we are going to participate in the legal meetings. And then she said, we need to accept what we can change. So basically, that's exactly what the Kremlin wants. We need to accept what we don't know how to change. And again, coming back to this politicization of medical discourse, she accepted that our critique of the Russian state, starting from April 2020, was unduly politicized, and she accepted the guilt. She said, yes, we just did not realize that what we are saying can make a political argument. Well, which is a little bit naive, but still. And then again, that we were used by Navalny's, etc. An interesting point, again, she is not the only one who made a U-turn among these discourse producers, because the most recent video that I watched just literally a couple of days ago, she said, no, foreign vaccines are not good. It's just a waste of money of Russian taxpayers. So why would we need to open the Russian market to foreign products? It's not good. Again, a U-turn, just literally U-turn from the position that they advocated only, less than a year ago. So you see how inconsistent these discourses are. And this, I think, the last in my list, Maria Shukshina. Again, she's an actress, but she's quite politically active. She herself, she's not a professional. But what I'm referring to is a number of round tables that she convened with professional doctors and medical workers who are not very happy with Sputnik V. So in this sense, you see that the pandemic opened up the Russian discourse to, let's say, to polarization of positions and some kind of debate on medical/political issues. So basically what this circle of anti-vaxxers, and this is a very complex phenomenon, very interesting to study. On the one hand, they have, let's say, medical arguments. At least they try to develop medical arguments. On the other hand, these medical arguments might evolve into conspiracy theories and this apocalypse and the other type of things that miraculously become the destination point of this discourse. So basically what they say is Sputnik is unsafe, the whole process is very opaque, we don't know what is there. So what we are witnessing is a dangerous experimentation with our bodies, pressure and coercion, that medical protocols are standardized, so no one takes care about individual bodies, that then they, how shall I say, continue this argument saying that in general vaccination decreases resilience to infection, and there is a lot of controversial information. And then they go even more political, saying that the whole system of communication in Russia when it comes to relations between the government and the public is dysfunctional, that public authorities don't want to even react to any criticism, etc., etc. It's interesting that many of the speakers in this circle, they refer to the category of sovereignty. So basically the same category that became part of Putin's mythology, saying that this is a loss of Russian sovereignty that transformed human beings into biological objects. So we are losing our human agency and we are becoming biohumans, basically. It's really notorious and indicative that basically for them the major point of let's say major reference point is exactly the point that is important for Putin: loss of sovereignty, and the very negative attitude to the West starting from 1991. Now, how it affects Putin and a regime in a general sense. What I was referring to in the last 15 minutes was basically discourses. But there are also practices. And I think discourses and practices are very much related in this specific case. Because what happened is that basically Putin and the Kremlin lost its centrality in producing discourses, in producing narratives that would be constitutive for the national debate on Russian identity, on Russian foreign policy when it comes to promoting Sputnik abroad, etc. So Putin became just a bystander in this debate, and I think this is not only a discursive phenomenon. It's not just a loss of ability to produce discourses, but it's also an institutional decentering, institutional detachment of Putin from the center of political milieu. I would say that for many countries that would not be a problem. And we know that in many countries this de facto decentralization of decision-making authorities is a matter of everyday life. No one wants to take responsibility, so the government relegates some functions to mayors or to subnational authorities. They relegate these decision-making functions to employers, to universities, for example, and rector, basically that's what happens in many places, relegates specific decisions to institutes and whatever, and even individual individual teachers and instructors. So in let's say in liberal environment, that's okay. But when it comes to explicitly illiberal regimes, this decentering of the main figure, of the holder of sovereignty, makes the situation a little bit more different. And basically what happened in 2020 is that Putin kind of institutionally detached, voluntarily detached himself from the crisis management, everyday crisis management, which made him, according to Konstantin von Eggert, a lonely man in a bunker, or as Pavel Baev, who is again I think well known here in Oslo, decliner in chief. So I think these two characterizations are very, I would say, right to the point, and they might be also accompanied by other, let's say, strange statements coming from Putin. July 2021, Russia is in the middle of the deadliest third wave, and the situation is critical. What the Supreme Sovereign said, that Russia has overcome the disastrous effects of the pandemic, and we are now facing a bright future, right in the middle of the crisis. So all the things taken together, they really create, let's say, a number of questions. To what extent this mythology of Putin's centrality in, let's say, in decision-making sphere, in policy-making sphere is real or fake when it comes to critical situations. I think this is the most serious crisis that Putin is facing, the crisis for which all the resources that Putin was intentionally investing in, military resources and resources of securitization and resources of land grabs, etc., they just don't work. They are useless. And the country is desperately needs different type of resources. And that's what might explain this kind of Putin's vacillation between reiteration of his, let's say, habitual and traditional centrality, and in the meantime, de facto, his detachment from decision-making procedures. Another important point, Putin's position on the vaccination. It was perceived as very controversial, especially taking into account the Russian political culture. So what Putin said is that, no, I'm against mandatory vaccination. Definitely, the rights of patients and the human rights, we don't have emergency. It's up to each one of our citizens. But if your governor decides otherwise, I'm also okay with that. I would say that Putin was unable to produce a politically non-controversial position on this issue. And again, this is not about Ukraine, this is not about Syria. This time it's about Russia. It's about people who live in the country and who need to get a certain message. If you are against, but if you are okay with the governor who is against what you are against. So this creates a little bit of a disorientation, and that's also what might explain, to some extent, it shouldn't be taken as the most or the central explanatory argument, but it might explain the low level of vaccination and trust to Sputnik. And I think I'm finishing here to what extent let's say, I also want to finish on something more theoretical. To what extent this case of Russia might either sustain or the other way around to disprove the Schmittian version of sovereignty, and his explanation of sovereignty that is based on political will and distinction between friends and enemies. So that's something that Putin liked very much. I mean, collective Putin and the Kremlin, they were very much embedded in this Schmittian mythology of power that was necessitated two major points. Now, I think, and that's my concluding point, none of these pillars of sovereignty seems to be relevant today. You cannot securitize the virus. The virus is not like an enemy, it's not like terrorists, it's not like Ukrainian fascists or whoever. And political will is lacking. What is political will in a situation of, let's say, very dispersed debate in Russia, the appearance of different islands of clusters of discourse, with a complete, let's say, silence from the part of the sovereign authorities. And another thing, it's about exceptionalization and normalization. Again, according to the Schmittian perspective, a sovereign is intended to exceptionalize a situation, because this exceptionalization might give sovereignty a right to make decisions, skipping normal rules. Well, I don't see that in, frankly speaking, in the Russian case. What they try to do, they try to normalize the situation as opposed to exceptionalize. They try to manipulate with numbers and figures. They try to send these tranquilizing messages that nothing happens. So this is a Russian way of normalizing the situation rather than exceptionalizing it. And in this sense, I think the whole structure of Russian sovereignty needs to be, let's say, rethought in the light of what is going on, because it's not political will and it's not the ability to identify enemies that matters. It's resources, it's capacity to control the society, and something which is known as governmentality, again in the Foucauldian language. So I started with Foucault and I'm finishing with Foucault, so that's the theoretical circle in which I'm just trying to place this case. Thank you very much.
We have to reorganize the stage a little bit.
I suspected that the screen would move up.
Thank you for a very interesting and clarifying talk. Before we start taking questions from the audience, I have one thing that I wanted to ask you. There's an inherent depoliticizing, at least seemingly, element to biopolitics. And the pandemic has given us a new type of data that is seemingly unpolitical, but may tell us a lot about the state of Russian politics. And so this is actually a double question. Because you said that the virus cannot be securitized, right? But a poll that just came out this week or last week from the Levada Center said that 61% of Russians think that COVID is not a normal natural virus, it's a biological weapon. And then the other part has to do with vaccine turnout. So only around a third of the population is vaccinated, as you say, and because of the political development, it can be hard to rely on traditional means of obtaining knowledge.
It might render depoliticizing effect in the case if you have a clear argument based on knowledge, on medical expertise, but this is not sufficient. And you should have high level of trust in the society to whatever comes from the government or from medical institutions somehow related to the government. Well, in this sense, I don't think that the trust is the strongest point in, let's say, Russian government's communication with the society. And to some extent, this is also a test to, well, let's say, suspiciously high number of Russians who are ready to vote for United Russia and support Putin. I think COVID-19 might be a better test for the issues of trust, better than election or elections. Because I do think that this is about trust to a very significant extent. Biological weapons. Well, there is nothing surprising in this 61%, because this biological weapon, as I understand, is a part of a broader, how should I say, conspiratorial thinking that the state itself was promoting for years, if not decades. So if the state was very sympathetic with this type of discourse in the last couple of decades, why should we be surprised having this 61%? So people believe in that because they were told that this is the case, because they were told that there are biological laboratories in Georgia, for example, in Ukraine, in Kazakhstan, that are developing ethnic weaponry against Russians, so the weapons that would be able to kill only, people with a specific genetic, how should I say, background, and of course these are Russians. I mean, all this type of thinking were part of the, well, I would say either mainstream or very close to mainstream discourse, and now they give their fruits when it comes to COVID. So in this sense, it's everything is interrelated in this chain of discourses.
Do we have any questions, Julia?
Thank you, and thank you for a very interesting talk. I have a couple of questions, and I think an interesting exercise is always to compare, and it's a very good opportunity to compare. So I'm wondering about your observation of inconsistent discourse. You mentioned it for several of these groups, but whether it could be possible to give them the benefit of the doubt to some extent, because this inconsistent discourse, we have it also in Norway, and much of it is actually because there is too little knowledge and nobody knows how this pandemic will evolve, and therefore you have a very inconsistent discourse also in Norway. So that's a question. To what extent, some of these actors, is it actually that they get more information and thus they change their approach? And then secondly, on the doctors' alliance, which this independent movement and their change, I'm thinking, again, trying to give them the benefit of the doubt. If you are more geared towards the problem, right, the health of the Russians, then you might conclude that the fight between opposition and regime, kind of bringing the regime down at any cost, is not the right path for you. You would rather try to work within the system there is to reach your goal, which is to increase the health of the Russians. So again, is it possible to give them give a more nuanced picture as to what their agenda is, how we read these texts? And then finally, and this is a more theoretical point, I agree that the virus, that they have not been exceptionalizing the situation in the Kremlin. But I disagree that they couldn't. Surely you can securitize a virus. And that's, I mean, in Norway, for example, we have seen that. The virus has been securitized as the largest threat to the Norwegian population. And we've had lots of sacrifices on that altar in terms of young people's psychological health, or so you can securitize a virus. Would you agree with that?
Well, on these inconsistent discourses, well, of course, first of all, I'm trying not to be judgmental, keeping a certain distance, and just basically looking at this situation from more like, let's say, analytical perspective, which basically implies that yes, doubts might be a part of, of the whole process, and even well, to some extent, I'm glad that Russia is moving from a more or less unified type of thinking when it comes to, I don't know, Ukraine or Syria and other situations, to something much more plural, much more with a greater degree or level of doubts and inconsistencies. Because inconsistency is a part of developing each and any discourse, and we know that from theoretical perspective. So, I mean, there is nothing unusual. The problem here is that this, let's say, pluralization of discourses and the intrinsic inconsistencies of each of them is a problem when it comes to communication between the government and the population, because it turns out that population are expecting, or the population is expecting, not this pluralization of debate, which would be quite consistent with the democratic legitimacy, etc., but they're expecting clear messages. I was doing some interviews in Narva, which of course is Estonia, but many people living there, having Russian linguistic and ethnic roots, they, I think, might represent this type of thinking that is also typical for Russia. And some of my interviews said that, yes, we are not going to vaccinate because we don't think that the government takes it seriously. If the government, I mean Russian government and Estonian government, if the government have a luxury of debating and being inconsistent, that means that there is no emergency. And if there is no emergency, why would they expect us to do something that we don't like to do? So if it's emergency, leave it up to us to decide. So you see this type of thinking, which I think explains something which needs to be explained. This low level of vaccination, low level of trust to the vaccine. Even locally produced vaccine. Even Sputnik V. So that's a paradox. Something which is allegedly is a major Russian soft power instrument, allegedly again, is not perceived in this capacity within the country. And now, Doctors Alliance. Well, of course, there is a conceptual part in this, let's say, trajectory, which basically boils down to the question of, are you a political combatant or you are an organization that takes care of human lives and their bodies. So to some extent there might be some tension between these two, let's say, these two identities, these two profiles. But I don't think that in the case of Anastasia Vassilieva that was the most important let's say, explanatory factor. Because I think she was just personally very much offended by the fact that she invested a lot into Navalny's network and she made it public. And in the meantime, when it came to her personal safety, I think she was threatened, I think she was taken into custody, and she mentioned that her children are not safe, etc. So when it came to her personal affair, no one was even close to, not even to help her, but she said no one even gave me a call of, I mean, sending a message of encouragement or just some verbal solidarity. No. I think that's something personal that was a driving factor in her decision to say, okay, but if in case of critical situation for myself, I'm on my own, let's say, I mean, enjoy the life and like a bare life. Well, biopolitical bare life, I mean, it's up to you, you against the state. No, if it's me against the state, not playing this game. So I think that was something that was more personal in this story. And then securitization of course, it depends on definitions, how you define securitization. What I had in mind is that you cannot securitize virus from the agency perspective. In my view, a virus does not have an agency. It's a part of the nature. What you can securitize is, you can securitize, for example, a country that produced the virus, and then you can open it to the political discussion with some, again, conspirological theories. You can, potentially you can securitize people who are spreaders of the virus, but only in these, relatively narrow frames that securitization is possible. Otherwise, it's more about adaptation. And I think this is a major point in the debate that we need to live. It's not going to be eliminated or eradicated completely. We need to learn how to live with this virus for years. So basically, that's the type of discourse that I think is very much affecting the debate.
I have one comment and two questions. The comment is about this issue of securitization of the virus. Maybe something could be explained by the fact that in the public debate, both in Russia and in the West, the place where the virus originates from is China. Does it have anything to do with this kind of imposition of virus, China-Russia relations? Is it a factor in the public debate at all? Had this virus been identified as coming from the West, the United States, or another place, it would be much more easier to make it a security issue, because it could be kind of presented as a way of influencing Russia by the West. So this is my comment on the issue of securitization. But this also brings another issue. I think that what has been a very interesting topic, especially when you were talking about those deniers in the first place, I see a number of similar developments in Russia. For instance, when the United States were developing the shale gas technology, there was also a lot of denial in Russia. It's about, to a very large extent, the issue of Russian exceptionalism, that what the West is doing is not something that we have to be afraid of, because we are different. It was also a very similar way of dealing with the economic crisis in 2008. We saw that there were a lot of people in Russia denying that this crisis would have an effect on Russia, because Russia was different. This was the Western issue and Russia was something different. And I think also that this whole issue of seeing the COVID as a biological weapon is also a case of Russian exceptionalism, because if you develop a weapon that is to kill on a specific group of people, then it's also very much about being exceptional. And then my second question or comment is about bringing this whole issue of biopolitics to an even higher level of problematic, because it's you have been talking a lot about dealing with the issue of COVID in Russia, but as I see the discourse and the debate developing in Russia nowadays, it's more and more about not about only biopolitics, but it's also about thanatopolitics. Thanatopolitics is about how you deal with the issue of death in the kind of political sphere, and this has become an issue because you have those statistical data being produced over the past couple of months showing that there is a kind of very high level of dead in Russia. So this is also going to have most probably some political implications in the longer run. And this brings also the issue of exceptionality, because in Russia you have a slightly different approach to sacrifice death and so on and so on. You have this as an important element, for instance, of the Russian discourse on the patriotic, on the Great Patriotic War. Thank you.
Okay, point by point. China, it's a very important point. I think what happens is a very slow, how shall I say, detachment of Russia from this utopian idea of Russian-Chinese alliance and Russian-Chinese friendship and Russian-Chinese whatever. And it takes different forms. One of them is what I would call popular whatever biopolitics. Just to give you one example, in one of Yelena Malysheva's TV shows, talk shows, there was an episode, and I think it was March 2020, of a poor Chinese guy who was traveling in Russian Far East, and he was diagnosed with COVID, and he was given a kind of self-blaming interview to the first channel, Первый канал, saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm a spreader. I'm a bearer of the virus. I'm so sorry that I made so much trouble to our Russian neighbors, and I beg your pardon for that." And that took 5 minutes of kind of self-blaming, etc. And that was shown as part of the story. What kind of conclusion can be drawn? Oh, it came from China, and they are sorry for that. This is what I would call a popular biopolitics. It's just a popular genre. But in the meantime, there's also more professional debates on China. And if you look at what most of Russian think tankers think about China, is again this type of indirect detachment from China as allegedly the main reference points. What most of Russian think tankers say after COVID-19 is that yes, we are facing a new bipolarity. It's U.S. The structure of international relations is more or less clear. It's U.S. and China versus against whatever, which basically means there is no space for Russia in this Supreme League. So they are not even claiming that we can be number 3 or whatever. It's Russia and China. And basically, most of Russian think tankers say, oh, and this is okay. I mean, that will give us a little bit of, a pause and let them, do whatever they want with each other. So basically, that's a kind of an indirect form of not alienating, but detaching Russia from close relations with China. There is no talk about that, I think, anymore. How Russia is different, your second point, as I understood that. Again, there are different levels of this Russian specificity, particularity, exceptionality. One is on the level of public perceptions, and some of these perceptions are very simplistic, saying, well, Russia is unaffected, Russia is different, etc. But on the level of professional debate, I think it's pretty much the same type of answer that I can give you. But on the level of professional debate, the situation is different, a bit different. If you look at the reports and other materials of Russian think tanks, well, I would say 1/2 of Russian professional think tankers would say that national solutions are not a solution at all, that it's not about promoting specificity. Russia needs to come back to the old agenda of liberal international society. Russia needs to raise the issue of mutual recognition of vaccines, of creating some kind of platforms for debating this issue, that Russia needs to go green along the European Union, etc., etc. So what I see is a kind of a change, at least in certain segments of Russian think tank community, which again is about more pluralizing the debate rather than unifying it. So in this sense, the idea of Russia's exceptionality is not the main point in think tank community. And Naterstad was always behind biopolitics. It's just a matter of how you identify this Naterstad. I still think that Russian debate on COVID-19 is more about biopolitics. It's about healthcare and protection rather than Naterstad. But there are some Naterstad motifs when, for example, vaccine producers say that, of course, you can have your own regulations and you don't open your gate for Russian vaccine, but by not doing that, you kill people. So in fact, some of the Russian discourse makers want to, well, kind of blame or accuse Western countries in well, indirectly killing their people by not accepting Sputnik V. So that's a type of thing. Or, for example, take the Russian mission to Italy in spring 2020. It was a biopolitical, but in the meantime, it was also to some extent another political. I mean, death is everywhere, and then you have a miraculous figure of Russian semi-military, semi-civilian guy who is making a disinfection, etc. So this is also more biopolitical than political, but political is definitely a contextual thing here.
I think we'll take Helge, Daniela, and then Paul.
I grabbed the mic. I'm not sure if it's my turn, but thank you very much for an interesting presentation, Andrey. I would like to get back to the lonely man in the bunker. You said that he's losing his, or this demonstrates that he's losing his grip on power. He's the lonely guy sitting there, detached from what's going on, and that power is being concentrated in other hands. But given that you don't know the answer to how to fight the pandemic, and you know that unpopular decisions have to be made, couldn't it also be just that you deflect responsibility, transfer responsibility, blame it on the governors? I told them that they should fight the pandemic, and they were unsuccessful, or you could point to them and blame them for introducing the unpopular measures. So could that be part of the explanation, or is he really losing his grip on power? And if he is, and you said power is being concentrated on other hands, whose hands? And you also ended up by talking about this as an attempt at normalization rather than exceptionalization. But with this transfer of power to other hands and a diffusion of power, would that actually be normalization in the longer run? Would it stick, or is this an exceptionalization, the normalization?
Well, my honest answer would be that, well, I don't know for sure, so we can just debate this. I mean, we are studying something which is in the making. So we don't know what the destination point. We don't know what's going to happen, I mean, in 1 year from now. And I think this is a very, let's say, long-term process. I think the major thing here is how we relate responsibility and power. The game that the Kremlin wants to play is to transfer responsibility without transferring, well, something which they understand as power. Because regions are as financially dependent on the center as they were. And Natalia Zubarevich, for example, she made it clear that the transfer of responsibilities does not change a vertical of financial submission of regions to the federal center. So in this sense, if you look at that from financial perspective, nothing has changed, I mean, politically. But in the meantime, I think that this, how shall I say, transfer of responsibilities and this Putin's decentering might have long-term repercussions, because what happens in the political domain, in the political terrain, is a very serious blow to the whole political mythology of his rule, of his regime. And I don't think that this went unnoticed in the society. Because if you build your power base on the presumption that the supreme commander-in-chief and the supreme holder of sovereignty is absolutely central for both normal and abnormal times, and if you see that what happens is not exactly what this mythology was about, Well, my hypothesis is that this, in one way or another, should affect his power base and his agency, his subjectivity, and his ability to remain central in the decision-making universe, even after the end of COVID-19. Another, you asked, I mean, in what hands these responsibilities and some decision-making powers have been concentrated? Well, I think it's the government. Even if you look at the headline news on COVID in Russia, it's ministries, it's the government, prime minister, ministries, Rospotrebnadzor, health ministry, etc., etc., etc. So the agency here is quite clear, and the governors, subnational units in Russia. The thing is, and that's what I don't know, the governors were fighting for these powers for years, and they could not even dream of having them, just like, you know, falling from the sky. Oh, really? Now Putin said, "Oh, but you know better what to do." Really? Say it again? I mean, nice to know. So I'm just trying to think whether this is reversible, whether at a certain point it would be that easy. That's, I mean, the time of relegation is over. Now all these powers are, well, back to the Kremlin. Well, I don't know, but that would be very interesting. How should I say, situation? Whether governors would be that happy to. Okay, now you know better. Starting from, let's say, Monday, you know better how to rule. I don't know, but I think it won't be that easy, because many of the government, they're really making decisions concerning regulations within labor market, lockdowns of enterprises, introduction of special measures, including de facto mandatory vaccination in the whole region, including border checks when it's necessary. So, I mean, the amount of powers is quite significant. It's not just something purely symbolic. It's very much down to the earth and something which affects life. Again, it's a big question mark. What's going to happen with these powers in the years to come? Yeah, so that would be my answer. Not very specific, but more like contextual.
Yes, hi, hello. My name is Daniela Slabinsky, and I'm a research assistant here at NUPI. And thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I have one short comment and a question on, like, continuing the debate about the man in the bunker. I was wondering whether or not this could actually boost the idea of Putin as being exceptional and different from everyone else, or has it been strongly ridiculed in the Russian media? My main question, do you think now, like during the corona and maybe also post-corona, that the idea of patriotism in Russia has changed? And also whether or not the legitimacy of the discursive actors on patriotism has changed among people in Russia? Thank you.
Well, I think, no, in the Russian, let's say, mainstream media, Putin is not ridiculed. He just lost his indispensability for understanding of what's going on. I mean, just imagine that you don't know who Putin is. I mean, just a guy. I mean, the knowledge about what Putin thinks, where he is physically, where he's going to be next day, is not that important anymore. So he just lost his indispensability for understanding, analyzing, or debating Russia. You can easily discard him. That's what I mean. You could not discard that easily. You could not discard him as a figure in other cases because he was central. Now he's not central anymore. Again, I'm not trying to draw very far-reaching conclusions out of that. It might be that this is a temporal and this is not that significant, but I still think that this is quite significant. Now, patriotism, well, it depends on how you define patriotism. Well, in many countries, patriotism in times of COVID is related to responsible behavior. It's like, you know, you are a good member of the community you keep social distance, you don't do what you're not expected to do, etc. So that's a kind of domestic patriotism. In that case, I mean, Russia is very much split, and the level of, acceptance of these new rules and regulations is quite low. So in this sense, I mean, if you say to Russians, well, your patriotism is to go and vaccinate yourself, well, maybe that would not be that, let's say, well accepted. Patriotism, when it comes to international, let's say, dimensions, is much more clearly, how shall I say, accentuated, because it is about Sputnik V. I mean, the whole name of the product, Sputnik. It's like, you know, a reference to the old Soviet times, etc. Whether it might work or not in long-term perspective, I don't know. And again, how to measure it. This patriotism is compromised by very clear market logic behind Sputnik V. They want 25% of the global market of vaccines. That's what I could read between the lines. I mean, is it patriotic to have 25% of the global market of vaccines? Of course, not in the West, but most likely in Latin America, in Middle East, and in some Asian countries. Is it patriotism? Well, of course, they say that this money will be used for the benefit of Russian people. But if it comes from Russian Foundation of Direct Investment and from one of the Russian tycoons, well, I don't think that all Russians would take it as a face value. So I think there are many people who would say that Sputnik V is the most contemporary incarnation of Russian something patriotic, that we are not just producers of vaccine, we are saviors, like Russia in Italy, for example. If you look at the coverage of Russian mission in Italy, it was, it's like a miracle. What Russians did for Italy, it's like, and that was very patriotic in the sense that we are just doing something good, and we are coming back to Europe in a different capacity, not as occupiers, not as land grabbers, but just a force for the good. It did not work. Of course, they wanted to expect that sanctions might be lifted because of that, or in some kind of connection to that. It did not happen. And Italy is now one of the countries that says, well, most likely Sputnik V will never be accepted in Europe. So, I mean, Russia really faces a difficulty in transferring its standalone actions of a very high degree of publicity into something tangible. Okay, what stems from that? Almost nothing. So in this sense, patriotism, I think, is a very shaky foundation for measuring the success or failure of Russian foreign policy in times of COVID.
Thank you, Andrey, for a very interesting, thought-provoking talk. A few points. First, you described to us a very lively debate, media debate, and with very diverse positions, not only apparently in the marginal highbrow media, but also in ether media and mainstream media. We are used to think that an authoritarian regime can allow an open debate on non-political issues, but not on political issues. And you can say that COVID-19 is not a political issue, but it's something even more important. It's a matter of life and death. And the fact that they are able or allow such a high degree of debate was to me a bit surprising. And so how should we interpret that? At the same time, as far as we can read from Norwegian media at least, it seems that there are limits to what can be discussed, and such as some information is suppressed on the actual number of deaths and so on. And on the issue of securitization, I guess we have cleared up what do we mean that you say that the virus as such cannot be securitized, but of course people can speculate that there are some hostile forces out there producing it in order to harm us, and there is such a debate, and there is such a discourse, an official, and that you explain the 60% who believe in that. By sort of the track history of the Putin regime in that regard. But then again, we could perhaps, as a thought experiment, say that why the Putin regime could jump on that and use it and say yes, or probably, well, there are CIA or someone else has produced it in order to ruin the Russian nation, and they have not done that. So I found that remarkable. There is a possibility here, but that they did not use. And on the level of, if I may, on return to the issue of trust, we know that there are enormous differences between countries in the world on how many are getting vaccinated, and Russia among those are low on that, about 35% or something. And the one factor that stands out to explain these differences is level of trust in the authorities. So this is a sign of that level of trust in the Russian political regime. But you can also say the opposite, that when Putin is, you say he's not hands-on sort of taking charge himself of the combating the epidemic, but he has clearly said that you should take the vaccine. But they still don't. So then it seems to me that not only can the low level of trust explain why there are so few people taking the regime, but also when the regime says that you should do it and they still don't do it, that will, even as I guess you have already said so, is reducing trust even further, because when your father said you shouldn't do something and you still do it and it doesn't, I can't do anything about it, then your respect for your father is going even further down.
Okay, again, point by point, I definitely agree with you that, well, we used to think that authoritarian regimes, well, illiberal regimes, they might be okay with, allowing or tolerating debates on technical, non-political issues. Well, the problem with this definition is that the boundary between political and technical is not always clear, and it is established by political discourse as such. So it's political discourse as such that said, oh, this issue is technical, and this is not technical. So how this boundary functions depends on the political core, the key political discourse producers or discourse makers. But in the case of Russia, definitely what happened is that the debate became much more diversified, variegated on political issues, and that's what I think is one of the factors of change. Again, I'm not over-exaggerating the importance of this change, but I think the change is here. It's quite clear. Then on your second point, I mean, explaining this plurality of debate, including in the so-called mainstream media and discursive community, I think one of the explanations is that the Kremlin was very late in producing its own discourse, and they did not have an argument that would be as clear as, for example, the argument that they had in the case of Crimea, and something like that. So they did not have a clear argument. What is all this about? So they were late, and to some extent the Kremlin was disoriented. It was confused with choosing the right way to go, and that's exactly why this discursive vacuum or the void was filled by other voices, which again is nothing surprising for, let's say, relatively liberal countries, but it is surprising for illiberal country as Russia. Why the Kremlin did not jump on this anti-Western discourse, including accusations and playing with the CIA card? Well, I think because again the Kremlin did not have one single argument. On the one hand, so they wanted both. They wanted to promote the specificity and this, the purity of Russian body, collective body, I mean, and the role of Russia as indispensable power for the whole world. On the one hand, And on the other hand, they wanted to rebuild some bridges that have been broken after 2014. Putin claimed that, okay, now sanctions have to be lifted, with a very naive explanation. Oh, no, it's not about Russia, it's just on the global scale, of course. And many countries are suffering from sanctions, so we were just advocating for all those who have been marginalized by the West, etc. So again, they were trying to maneuver, they were trying to find some niche for more or less cooperative solutions. Even now, when it comes to a clear, let's say, gap between Russia and the European Union when it comes to the acceptance of the vaccines, even the vaccine war, I would say, well, Russia is much less confrontational than I would expect from them. Because Russia can be confrontational when it comes to, let's say, traditional international actors, which might be threatened, which might be blackmailed, etc. But when it comes to, let's say, European Medicines Agency, what can you do? It's exactly the same what happens with World Anti-Doping Agency. When Russia is facing these institutions that I would call biopolitical, Russia does not know what to do. What can you do with WADA, with World Anti-Doping Agency? Can you annex part of its whatever? What can you do? Can you threaten with nuclear weapons? What can you do? And Putin, the case of Russian anti-doping scandal was the first case when Putin admitted the guilt. Instead of saying, oh, but this is a century-long conspiracy. No, he said to the government, it's your fault. You do not follow the regulations on prohibited substances, and now you clean the mess. That's what Putin said. It was really not his style, not a single anti-Western thing. No, he said, look, that's what you did. Now enjoy the results. And I suspect something, it's pretty much the same style might be tracked when it comes to this very technical procedures of acceptance of or the regulations when it comes to vaccines. They don't know how to apply, again, traditional instruments that worked in the case of Syria, that worked in the case of Ukraine, Belarus. Now it's a completely different world that is opening up. And when it comes to last point, Putin's, how shall I say, recommendation you should take the vaccine. What is interesting in this case is the reaction of the society. And the reaction is, but did you get your vaccine, your jab, and what kind of vaccine? Why didn't we see that? And Putin had even had to explain, okay, but I'm not supposed to show my body. It might be not only shoulder, it might be other parts of my body. Why should I go public with it? And the reaction was, oh, but many other leaders, they did it in public. So basically, again, that leads me to something which is extremely biopolitical. The book of Ernest Kantorovich, Two Bodies of the King, dates back to the 50s or 60s, which basically means that the king has two bodies. One is physical body, another is political body, like, you know, exemplification of his political sovereignty. And it's interesting that in this debate, the Russian public was very much interested with the physical body of the king. They wanted to see, which basically, it does not attest to a high level of trust to words. They want to see that he is jabbed, well, in real, and with Sputnik and not with some other vaccine. So they wanted to have a proof, a visualized proof of that. And Putin did not give this proof. He said, you need to believe me. Okay, nice to know.
We're approaching the end, but do we have any questions from cyberspace or no? Then I have a last question, because we know each other through the Legitimacy project on regime legitimation. So I have to ask: can the regime fully recover from this? And at what cost?
Well, the regime will definitely recover, but I suspect it's going to be a different type of regime, not only because of COVID, but COVID is one of the factors that might change important elements and important foundations on which the regime is based. First of all, I think the concept of power might have been reconceptualized. Again, the traditional for Russia ingredients of power are not that helpful. So the whole idea of power as resilience rather than a power as a transgression might get a better acceptance in the Russian political elite and in the society. And if this hypothesis is true, well, that's good news. Power as resilience is much more compatible with, let's say, Western expectations and understandings of what power is, as opposed to power as coercion or as force projection or other types of power that Russia was quite comfortable with for at least a decade, if not more. So in this sense, the issue of power might have changed. Then I think the regime might also reconsider the validity and relevance of Putin's mythology based on, well, I would say very strong media injections and all this type of narratives that have been produced to prove the indispensable centrality of Putin within political system. So I think this might be reconsidered. Again, I don't know to what extent and whether it might be a long-term development or just a temporal. But even if it's temporal, it opens up, let's say, some windows of opportunity. I don't believe in, let's say, far-reaching breakthroughs in the development of Russian political system. What might happen is just some kind of openings, some kind of chances that will not last forever, and whether those chances would be properly used by those forces in Russia who want change, who might have invested some kind of their resources into making this change possible. Well, that's already a good news.
Thank you, Andrey. Before we end, this seminar is part of a series of seminars from the Legitimacy project on values-based regime legitimation in Russia. And this is not the last seminar in our series. So keep an eye out for new announcements, and thank you for coming. Thanks for good questions.
Thank you very much, Tora.